Okay, welcome into the shop. It's great to have you out here. Now on this build, we're gonna do things a little differently. This is a build that we built probably like 4 or 5 months ago. So I've been sitting on this footage for a while. I don't have all the footage. This isn't like an in-depth build. So what we're gonna do is jump forward to the brass rings that get installed on this tabletop. A couple things real quick. First of all, the piece behind me, which might have caught your eye because it's got these beautiful pecan veneer sliding bypass doors. This is a build that's about to get delivered, and I'm going to have a video on this one. So I just wanted to clarify that this is not the build for this video. This is coming in the future. Now, one thing I can say is I do have a Patreon page. I do post shop updates on that. Try to do one weekly or every 2 weeks. And there's quite a few updates on this build and how I did it. So if you want to already see content on this, go support me on Patreon. That is in the description. You can go check that out. Let me get you up to speed on this table build. So real quick overview. It's a repurposed stone base. It's about 15 by 15. And it is a limestone, really heavy stone base that we're going to cantilever this big 10-foot table off of. So we've built a metal frame to go on the stone to kind of support this tabletop. The tabletop's 10 feet by about 42 inches wide. It's a torsion box with a Rifson white oak veneer on that box that is pre-fumed. So if you don't know anything about fuming, it's a process in which you react with the tannins in the wood using ammonia, and it darkens the wood. So this veneer has been pre-fumed. We've laid up all the veneer on here. We've got a really heavy, beefy banding that goes all the way around the top, and we put a big miter kind of chamfer on it to kind of give it less mass. The reason it's so big and thick is because we've got this torsion boxes, and with torsion boxes, usually you're going to be minimum of 2.5 inches, 2.25. Then you get too squashed to even make a real purposeful torsion box. So that kind of gets you to where we're starting this video with the install of the brass rings. The point of the brass rings, so it's kind of a design feature. I did this in collaboration with my wife's uncle, who is a very creative, artsy guy. He builds awesome, he's a home builder, builds really cool buildings all throughout our town. And this was actually for his new home that he built. And he had this light fixture that he ordered that had hanging glass balls on it in different areas over the course of like 50 inches. And they kind of look like raindrops, almost like glass raindrops. So the thought he had was, let's put the brass circles in there to kind of correlate to water droplets falling on the table. I thought it was kind of crazy, but I also liked the challenge of doing it. And so that's what we're going to jump in and do now is we're going to install these brass rings, and then we'll take the table and you'll get to see it all get put together, installed in its home. So let's go ahead and jump into this video and get started. Okay, so we're going to start right here with this kind of overhead time lapse I shot of cutting the holes for the brass. So all the brass has been cut out on my CNC. I kind of went back and forth and got some different tooling and kind of played around with cutting brass. It's a soft enough metal that my CNC can do it. Some of the rings are solid. Some of the rings are like donuts. They have a hollow center. So I'm starting off by doing all the hollow ones first. I've made corresponding jigs to each ring to install these. So I'm using a plunge router with a bearing bit, and I'm using that jig that you just saw me pull off to route out basically the hole to accept the brass ring. Now you can see there's two kind of tabs built into the jig. Obviously you can't cut that jig out and not have some connection there, because then that center part would just fall out. So the tabs are just there to kind of hold that thing together. I'll come back and chisel those out after the fact. Now all the blue tape you see on the tabletop as well, we've pre-laid everything out. Robert came over and we kind of just played around. I made little plywood discs in various shapes and sizes, and we laid them out, and then that's how we decided where we want everything. It's pretty random, but we kind of played around with it. So you just saw me there. I chiseled that one out. Every one of these has to do a little bit of tweaking and fitting. So I have a 15-inch disc sander, and if the brass ring is a little bit off, I'll take it and mark it with this black Sharpie and be able to go to that disc sander and just kind of sand a little bit off to get it to fit. It was hard to get an absolute perfect fit on all of them. Some of them have little bitty gaps in there, but for the most part, I was really happy with how well these came together and how well they fit. A chisel on the inside, and then I got a little gouge there that has a curve to the blade, and that gets the outside and kind of helps me match the radius of the circle. When I'm done, I just mark it and know that it's finished, and I can set it to the side. Also, it's real critical that the depth is correct. So I set the depth of my router using the brass rings. If the brass sticks up too high, that's a problem. If the brass is too low, that's an even bigger problem, because you can't cut veneer off and go down the plywood. So I'm kind of leaning towards being high with the brass, and you're going to find out here soon in the video how that created a lot more work, because I did have to leave several of them high. I had a really hard time gluing them in, which, you know, that created some issues as well. The jigs are all being held down with double-sided tape. I use Gorilla Tape. You can get it at the big box store. Okay, so here's a little bit close-up of the chiseling. You can see that's kind of a gouge there. I'm just taking my time working those tabs off and then fitting each ring. If I'm having issues, like I said, I take it and do a little bit of sanding. I also have a spindle sander so I can work the inside of the brass ring as well. I don't try to chisel on the wood too much. You saw me doing a little bit there, but I try to take the material off the ring to make it fit. Also on the tape, I'm marking a little dash on the tape and on the brass ring so I know where the rotation needs to be when I put it back in. Everything is the same, you know, when I'm taking material off. If I spin the disc or spin the brass ring, it's going to change everything. So I make sure I mark that kind of a locating spot. Using the router to, I didn't explain that earlier, but I use the router to kind of rough out some of that tab material. Makes it a lot quicker, and then I can come back and just chisel it clean to the edges. Okay, so back up to a larger view, kind of get an idea of how this is working. There's a lot of these. I don't remember how many I put in, but it took several days to go through and cut these out. And obviously I want to take my time because this is a really expensive tabletop to this point. We put a lot of labor into it, laying up the veneer. The veneer is not cheap. The torsion box was expensive to build. So I want to take my time and not mess anything up here. This is pretty critical stuff. Now, a quick note on the fuming. I mentioned earlier in the intro of this that it was all fumed white oak. The banding that we added around it, we pre-fumed it. The way we built it is we basically built it as a frame, fumed the whole frame, and then slid it over the torsion box and created one. Now the long pieces you can tell blended really well and fumed just like the tabletop. The two end pieces, you can see that one close to the router is a lot lighter, and so is the corresponding end piece. I don't know what, you know, that's the challenge with fuming, is sometimes pieces go darker than others, and I ended up having to come back and do a little work with stain to actually blend that in. Here I'm thinking, because I'm having a hard time gluing these in, we're about to get more in depth on this, but figuring out how to get them to seat down. You know, the brass wants to bend on me a little bit, so I'm having a little bit of a struggle here trying to figure out what I'm going to do to glue these down. Okay, so moving forward to the glue up, I'm using epoxy, so I'm just trying to hammer these down in place. And like I said, I'm having a hard time. The brass is wanting to bend on me. It's not wanting to seat all the way down in the pocket, so there's too much sticking up. It's such, you know, when you have a lot sticking up, you can't just come and sand it down, because you could sand through your veneer for one, but it's a different hardness of material than your wood, so it's going to stand differently. It's going to still be raised and bumped, and once you shoot finish on that, you'll see these little ridges where there are high spots around every ring, and I really want to avoid that. So I'm struggling here to figure out a way to get these to really seat. And some of them I've been fine. The ones that you see that are already in place and got glue on them, those really I didn't have any issues with. This particular one here gave me a lot of problems. And the more you hit on it and try to hammer it in there, the worse it gets, because you start to bend it. So what I'm doing here is just I've got a thick chunk of pecan. I put some blue tape on it to keep that epoxy from sticking onto it. I'm just creating like a caul that goes across the table, and I'm going to put a clamp on each end and just, you know, do the best I can to put some force down and clamp this in place. Also, with the epoxy, the great thing about that is I have time to work with the material. I have time to, you know, I have open time before this glue sets. Also, the epoxy is going to set, it's going to hold really well on the brass. It's got probably a much better holding strength than, obviously, Titebond. Gorilla Glue would probably work, although I don't use Gorilla Glue a lot because it's just messy. Not that epoxy isn't that messy, but I think it cleans up better. And plus, epoxy fills gaps really well, so any little gap that I have in these rings, that epoxy is going to kind of take care of that. So next day, once that epoxy cures, I pull this off. I've got to end up doing probably 3 or 4 of them this way. So it took quite a bit of time to just clamp each one and let that epoxy dry. Because as you know, if you've worked with epoxy, it takes a little bit of time for that stuff to cure and set up. Now, even with the cauls, I had issues, you know, with them being too tall. So I'm going to have to solve that problem doing something other than sanding. And here you can see me kind of just getting a foam brush, taking that extra epoxy I've got and filling in any cracks and seams where the wood meets the brass. The epoxy will really match the color and blend pretty well, so you got to look pretty hard to find the areas that have been kind of repaired like this. And none of the gaps are that big. They're all fairly small, but there's some there. It's, you know, it's really hard to make a brass circle fit into a wood pocket. All right, so moving forward, doing a little night work here. First thing I'm going to try to do, obviously, is I'm going to see how this sands. I'm going to see what I can do. I've got like a 120 grit. I've already put sealer on the tabletop just to help protect it from glue, and it really was pointless, but I thought it would be good to put sealer on. The sanding isn't really working great. There's the ones that are just slightly proud, just a little bit, we're good. We can sand those, but there's several of these that are just sitting way too high. So I think I'm starting to realize here that it's going to be a lot of work to sand that brass down level to the table, and we're never going to get it, like I was mentioning earlier, never going to get it this nice clean level plane across with a sander. The sander's got soft pad. It's going to, wherever that brass is and you're trying to sand it down, it's going to have a raised spot. So here's my solution. I built a little sled for my router jig that has these blocks underneath that 1/2-inch plywood that raise the router up off the surface of the table. And then I try to keep those blocks on the wood and run my bit over the brass only. So you can see I'm trying to just mill the brass. Just shave off that 32nd of an inch, or even in some cases a 16th, and get it much closer to flush with the tabletop. It worked great. It was time consuming. It took a while. I had to be somewhat careful with this jig. I didn't want to ride up on the brass. I wanted to keep those tabs on the wood. So I'm making a nice clean flat cut on that brass, and obviously I couldn't go all the way down right to the surface of the wood because there's too much risk in cutting through the veneer. I really took my time at this, because the last thing you want to do is cut too deep and cut out your veneer. You're pretty much just toast at that point. I mean, it's a hard repair to do, and it's a labor intensive repair. It's very costly. So I'm taking my time, and I'm just trying to slowly mill this brass down to get it close to the surface of the table. This is a great shot to see how many of these I had to do, several of them, to get them, you know, down. And then I could come with like a 120 grit and do the sanding on it. And really, once you clean the mill marks off with that sander, I was pretty close to level with the wood. So it ended up working out really well. It's just like I said, it took a while to do this, just because I wanted to be careful, and it's just a slow process. This is a good shot here to kind of see how those mill marks go away and the sander kind of cleans it all up. It really is a pretty cool combination, I think, of colors between that brass and this fumed white oak. Okay, so fast forward a little bit. I'm just working through the grits. At one point I was at 120, I go 150, 180, then 220. It really polishes up the brass. Now the downside is, as I mentioned earlier, I had some issues matching up the color on the fuming. So I got the ends matched with a little bit of trickery from some stain, but Robert decided that he thought it should be a little bit darker in color. And so I didn't want to take stain directly to the top of the table. And you can see here, this is a great transition. The ends have been stained. You can see how they blend much better. It's a really light stain. Kind of airbrush it with a spray gun. And I've shot a coat of sealer. One of the challenges I was having with the sealer, the water-based sealer I used, was reacting to the brass. Which you can see right here. You can kind of see how that just made it look funky. So what I ended up doing is I had to sand back down to the brass here, clean all that tarnish up, and it didn't even do it to all the pieces. It only did it to some of them. And I actually called the manufacturer of the finish, it's Target Coatings, and he suggested that I seal it with a seal coat of shellac, which this is what I'm doing here. I'm just hitting it with that de-wax shellac, which shellac is an amazing finish. It'll seal off pretty much anything. It's alcohol based, so you're not throwing water on it. It worked great. It didn't react at all to the brass, and once I had it sealed off with the shellac, I could come back with my water-based conversion varnish and really hit it. And you can see here, so you can see how much, I want you to kind of see the transition from the previous shot to this shot. The brass rings are kind of fading out in brightness a little bit, and the reason for that is because I put trans tint in my finish to get that darker color that Robert wanted, to kind of blend the dark streaks and kind of make it all look, get to the color that he wanted. The only downside to that is it killed that brightness of the brass, which honestly for me, I don't think that's a big deal, and I don't think Robert minded either. And even you can see when I'm laying down this finish right here, you can see how the wet point, you can see how it's darkening the wood just the slightest bit, and it's in the finish. It's not actually, it's not staining the actual wood. So as we spray over the top of these brass rings, it's going to slightly darken over those, and it's going to hide that polished look, which, again, the verdict's out. I'm not sure how Robert received that. I'm not sure if that bummed him out. It might have looked a lot better with polished, really bright brass rings, but we wanted to get it darker, and so that this was the compromise that had to happen. So these are brand new, kind of cool apartment studios that Robert built. There are 3 stories. He's on the 2nd and 3rd story. The table's going on the 2nd story. The bottom stories are kind of commercial business spaces that he leases. This is the stone base that we've got to get up to the 2nd story. And you can see on the ground there is that metal steel frame. That was completely fabricated by someone else and then powder coated. I think the powder coating got a little bit away from us. Didn't quite get the color that he wanted, and he admitted that. But again, this thing's hidden under the table, so you really don't see it. We're about to have a sketchy exit here out of the trailer because this thing is really, really heavy, and there's no really holding it once it comes off the back of this trailer. Also, you might have noticed when we came off the trailer there, you might have been seeing through the blanket, there's a wood, kind of a wood foot we put on the base of the stone, and that has about an inch and a half ring or a frame around the bottom of the stone, and that gives us a point to bolt this actually to the floor. Robert didn't think it was going to be necessary, but I really encouraged that, hey, look, this thing has got a lot of leverage. It's got a big cantilever. I think we should probably screw it down to your floor. And so he was on board that. Thankfully, he built an elevator in his apartment. I guess he thinks he's going to live here until he gets really old and can't use the stairs anymore. So he's got a way to get up and down, an easy way for me to get this thing upstairs.
Hopefully the elevator is designed for this type of weight. 950 pounds. You want to keep it like you want to go. Yeah, I'd say you want to go one dude and that. You good? Yeah. See ya. Maya, Cone, Dio. I just got this. Oh, like we're all going to crack in the door. Yeah. Okay. Shut that door, would you?
Now, with the stone up, we're just going to take the staircase, obviously, with this big tabletop. It's not as heavy as you would think because it's a torsion box. That's the beauty of a torsion box. It's lightweight. It's kind of almost hollow inside. It's also super stiff, though, so it's not going to twist, sag. It's not going to, lose its form. It's a very stiff, lightweight way to veneer a tabletop. And there it is on the table base. You get an idea of that chandelier up above, the cool lights hanging down. He's got a lot of brass elements in his kitchen there, so that kind of ties in to the brass rings on the tabletop. That's a great shot from the side. I think it came out looking really cool. I love the form, the taper of that stone taper out to the outside of the table, and then even the tapered edges of the table kind of blend in well with it. Even, also the colors. He's got a walnut floor, got the white base, and then we go back up to a dark tabletop. Here I'm basically screwing the top through the metal base. When we designed a torsion box, we designed it in a way that it's solid anywhere that the metal is. So we got plenty of meat to screw into. You're not just screwing into like 1/4 inch skin on the torsion box. You actually are biting into something. And then you can see here, this is going in with some heavy duty screws, construction screws right into his floor. And that wood base is bolted and glued to the bottom of the stone. So I think we're pretty solid here. that's it. It came out looking awesome. I think it's just a really fun process collaborating with him. You can see the brass rings are kind of blending in there, hiding, but they're there and they catch your eye when you come up and walk up and see the table. And even when the light gets them right, they get pretty shiny. So it's just a cool looking table. I love the Rift white oak and how that looks with the stone base. Just a cool table. And the finish, the conversion varnish is just a beautiful finish. It's super durable. It's got a great sheen to it. It all came out looking great. It was a fun, challenging, exciting project. Hope you guys enjoyed the small part of this I shared with you. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. Love to hear your feedback on this one. And don't forget, you can go check out the Patreon. Help support the channel. Thanks again for tuning in.